For nearly 20 years through resistance, Krista and Mohamed talk revolution through the spiritual lens of their Egyptian and indigenous perspectives. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Anti-Case Taro. I am here today with Mohamed Abdu, and the two of us are going to talk about several different topics that we're both interested in and have talked about over the years. As the intro for this said, this is going to be two friends of nearly 20 years in struggle having talks on politics. Mohamed has been on here before to be interviewed about his book, Islam and Anarchism. And we are just doing this as questions we created. And Mohamed.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most gracious and most merciful. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace and glad tidings be upon you, Krista, our loved ones, and whoever, inshallah, might be listening at present and in the near future. As you know, I usually start anything that I say with Moses' prayer in the Quran when he was about to meet Pharaoh, accompanied by his brother Aaron. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. اللهم اشرح لي صدري, O Creator, open thy breast, ويسر لي أمري, and make my and our affairs easy. And undo the knot on my tongue, such that what it is that I have to share with you, what we have to share amongst one another, reaches folks' hearts, minds, and spirits.
Let's talk about Mamdani and the elections because it speaks to re-emphasizing what where folks are getting it wrong. And let's start with the basics. How is he bad for Palestine?
Thank you for that question. I think most of the debate and the conversation around Mamdani, who's a very savvy politician, brown face in a high place with a winning smile and a good set of speechwriters, are missing. Is the fact that he's an immigrant settler of color on stolen land, period. And either this is a settler colony, an American nightmare, an American dream. And Mamdani is merely a shiny veneer being placed, a polish, a new coat of paint on the Democratic Party, on the party of genocide, Joe. The same side of the same coin as MAGA. And you can't reform settler colonialism. You can't engage in a revolutionary takeover of settler colonialism, which is absurd. In what world are you going to take over the military, the pharmaceutical, the agrochemical, the school to prison, nexus, and so on and so forth? And so we could sit down, and there's been a lot of discussion about, well, he's back out of the arrest warrant on Netanyahu. Has he or has he not? He's kept NYPD commissioner, who's a Zionist stooge, of Eric Adams, who engaged in clampdowns on the encampments, who brutalized students, who panders in Islamophobia, and much more that is part of the primordial architecture of the crusading US settler colonial colony and its foundation in 1492, and Columbus's project, which we'll discuss. And so he keeps Jessica Tish on while hiring Alex Vital, who's written books on abolition. An academic, well, you can't exactly engage in statist abolition. Abolition is a movement of the below. It is not one to be usurped as part of a bullet point and electoral mandate by politicians of the above. Of course, he's critiqued Venezuela as well as Cuba as dictatorships. Now I got issues insofar as the limited potential of Venezuela as Cuba as being defined as revolutionary projects. Ultimately, they subscribe to a world of the above. International law, statism, human rights, discourse, and so on and so forth. But he's nonetheless, that doesn't give him legitimacy to sit down and describe them as dictatorships. He's backtracked on, defunding the police, and he's upheld Hakeem Jeffries, Speaker of the House. Jeffries is a Zionist. He receives money from AIPAC, and so on. But this is the facade of celebrity performative politics. Now I understand that people are invested in free buses, in better schools, and the delimitation of ICE raids, though he's not going to do and be capable of doing much with regards to that because he promised Agent Orange, Mr. Trump, that ICE raids will continue so long as, one remains within the scope of being charged insofar as 170 criminal offenses. And in that case, ICE can go ahead and arrest folks. The NYPD just won't interfere. It will be a hands-off issue for the NYPD. He's, of course, condemned from the river to the sea as a slogan by pro-Palestinian protesters. There are moves in Legislative Council to pass on a law that would forbid gatherings or protests, let's put it that way, at Zionist synagogues who sell Palestinian land on stolen land, because one should not disrupt places and houses of worship. So, but all these ignore the fundamental premise that he is a settler, a liberal Zionist, but a settler on stolen land. He could care less for the fact that his presence, his breath, contributes, because of his position of privilege and because of his complicity, to the ongoing genocide of indigenous and Black people in the context of Turtle Island. This is Leninaka territory. And the facade is the fact that Muslims would call him a caliph, that Muslims would call New Yorkistan. No, this is Leninaka territory. It always has been, and it always will be. So stop erasing the fact that this is a separate colony for your short-term victories that are merely band-aid solutions, that are merely substituting a plaster for the cracks in a collapsing building. But this is what I mean by the fact that people don't want to bask and claim that they are supporting the Mujahideen, but they don't want to learn and become actually students of the Mujahideen, particularly of Al-Qassam. Gaza is not dying, the Mujahideen are not being martyred, and our people are not being starved, so that the conquest of Turtle Island can continue at the expense of indigenous sovereignty and Black self-determination there. That is not the lesson to be learned. The reenactment of settler colonialism, but this is where people want to have their cake and eat it too. They don't want to contend with sharing more than what they can spare. They want to sacrifice and give up scraps under the larger fantasy of supporting Gaza. And this is the irony in all this. And then the facade of the industry that becomes built around Mamdani. Look at his father, who wrote a book, Neither Settler Nor Native, in which he talks about how 1492 produced a world of nation states, and their colonial entities, capitalism, that's a colonial entity, and how the nation state is tied to capitalism, etc., etc. But then ultimately, as part of his conclusion on the book, because he builds on the model of Africa, which is highly problematic insofar as its comparison to Palestine, because the context of Palestine is context in which the Zionist crusaders want to annihilate, eliminate, genocide Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, of course, Palestinian Christians, and many others along the way. Whereas in the context of South Africa, the Afrikaners wanted to conscript Black people as part of their plantation economy, did not want to genocide, or not at least mass industrialize genocide. And we're South Africa now, insofar as it's post-apartheid truth and reconciliation. The facade, same thing, of course, in the crusading settler colonial context of Canada. And it's Bill C-12 that wants to limit very much immigration, and so on, very much as sort of a fortress, uber-nationalistic, capitalist modus operandi, just as much as the US. And this is where the Liberal Party, no different than MAGA. So again, this goes beyond tax dollars. APAC has control of the US and Canada, all these myths, all these easy off-the-hook narratives that allow settlers of immigrants of color not to confront their complicity on stolen land. The same thing as I noted with Minnesota and Somalis being labeled as garbage. And in the end, all these memes that are coming out that are essentially saying, oh, look, well, the land, the 10,000 lakes, Minnesota, we cultivated, we engaged in the manifest destiny founding of Minnesota. Well, you're immigrant settlers of color and stolen land. This is, again, Anishinaabe Dakota lands, Ojibwe lands, and territory, right? But the failure to confront that becomes a problem. That doesn't take away from the fact that Somalis are Black, and hence they face the brutality of anti-Blackness and so on and so forth in the context of, again, the settler colony. But it doesn't take away from the fact that they are settlers of colony stolen land. A police officer will ultimately not distinguish a Black body that immigrated from Africa or one that was forcibly transplanted as part of the Middle Passage, right? But at the end of the day, a settler of color is a settler of color. That comes with this degree of complicities. But yeah, all these articles, look at the rings on Mamdani's fingers, look at his wife, the hypersexualization and Orientalist discourses associated with that. Look at who his father, this prominent academic, because at the end of his book, his father argues that, oh, everybody's colonized and everybody's a colonizer and vies for a politics of representation, of assimilation. That again erases the structure. This is why organizing has to do with structures, right? Is this a settler colony or is it not? And we deal with matters based on that premise. Indigenous people have long told us voting is not harm reduction, not for us, certainly.
We'll get to voting in a bit. So before we go on to the next part, do you want anything to wrap up with this part before I go on to the next question?
The assumption that Mamdani's election debases or disrupts Islamophobia, as opposed to the fact that, again, it is the backbone of the founding of the U.S. settler colonial state, which we can talk about when we discuss 1492. Mamdani doesn't take away from Islamophobia, which is a structural issue, insofar as the way that it is enshrined in law, how there are anti-Sharia movements, how that the FBI monitors and surveils mosques, how Muslims are placed on no-fly lists, how we are objects and subjects of terror. It only allows a bar of acceptability insofar as liberal Islamophobia and what is condoned and what is permitted, merely that. That is it. But the entire specter and carnival and circus surrounding Mamdani doesn't do anything insofar as neither disrupting Islamophobia nor the foundations of the U.S. settler colonial state. And the persistence, and again, the shiny veneer that's placed on the Democratic Party is neither is this election with regard to the governor in California either. It does not. Abolition and decolonization are anti-statist stances. They are movements of the below, not of the above.
I agree. Yeah, the police don't recognize the difference between Black descendant of enslaved people and a Black person who's migrated from Africa any more than ICE can tell the difference between an indigenous person who's born north of the U.S.-Mexican border and an indigenous person born south of it. So, but yeah. And brown leaders and Black leaders in white masks is something we've done before. People like to think of Obama, but I don't even think he's the best example, especially since he was also raised by white people or the white side of his family. And I think I would even take it a step further. If you were a politician in a settler colony, you're going to uphold the settler colony. You are going to have that white mask. And so I think then I would tie Mamdani to Wab Kinew. He's not a settler. He's indigenous to this land, but he is the premier of a settler colony. And a lot of people would like to see him become a leader of the settler colony because it would make them feel better. And it's probably white people who upheld Mamdani's election more than anybody else because they're the ones who get most excited when brown leaders have white masks and uphold settler colonialism for us. And then we all go along with it and get told we're finally chosen and we keep doing this. Why do we keep doing it? Also, I'm going to tie something else in here that came up before. Why we keep doing this, and is that tied to the same reason we keep all focusing on white allies over natural allies? If you want to tie the two together, maybe you don't, and I'll just cut that part out.
No, these are vital points because in the context of Palestine, for instance, you have Abbas Mansour, who's a Palestinian, who is refers to himself as a Muslim Brotherhood, who's part of the Israeli Knesset, and we call him as a traitor. How come this is the case in the context of a settler colony, a Zionist settler colony, but not in the context of the Squad, not in the context of Mamdani, not in the context of others? Whether, again, they're indigenous, whether they are Black, whether they are people of color. And a lot of people of color, particularly in the context of New York, wanted because they perceive that voting is a tactic. But as we'll get to, it is very limited in terms of what it can achieve and has historically achieved, even when the Panthers have engaged in very localized deployment of it. There were articles that actually were released comparing to Mamdani to Malcolm X, which is farcical. Malcolm was anti-American.
Yeah.
So this is the degree of force that goes back to the question of knowledge, history of social movements, of organizing and an analysis and the lack thereof that leads to the reinvention of the wheel and the false promises because it preserves a certain psychosis that the stream is salvageable, that the American project is a work in progress. And that's part of its myth that we'll talk about when we discuss 1492, because it is a myth that stands 533 years old. And the Zionist entity is merely a projection of the American dream 80 years into it. But this is the hypocrisy. When people do not want to heed and sacrifice and put everything on the line as our mujahideen and our people in Gaza, and do what is necessary and look to white allies and what paradigms and framings of liberation, because liberalism has imprinted on leftist politics as well. Marxism, on anarchism, and of course we have an Africanist Marxism, so on and so forth, which we can discuss. But nonetheless, that is part of the imprint on liberalism, the lesser of two evils, right? But look at the extent to which the pendulum is swinging to more and more extremes, right? Bush after Clinton and after NAFTA, the anti-globalization struggles, and then from Bush to Obama, drone president, Wall Street president that bailed out the banks that could care less for blue-collar workers, so on and so forth, let alone Black people that she shamed Black fathers as being absentee without looking or addressing the structural dynamics. Again, impoverishment,
Even
so far.
indigenous communities. They are not
Absolutely.
choosing to be shot and thrown in prison.
Absolutely. Right. So, and now to Agent Orange, to Genocide of Joe, back to Agent Orange again, Mr. Trump, right? And so Mamdani offers that way out, right, in a very superficial, liberal kind of way. And he's a very smart and savvy politician. Like I said, he hires both sides of the arguments to preserve this cultivation of differences of opinion and the continuity and the futurity of imperialism abroad as well as settler colonialism at home. But we are not looking to one another to build as people of color in relationship to one another because of the absence of trust, because we are not situated on the indigenous land that we stand on, and because we are less vested in that because of our routinization or systematization into every day we need to take our kids to school. Let us help out with some campaigns insofar as Gaza on fundraising without contextualizing our complicities in the core where we are. If we are keen on Gaza's liberation and Palestine's liberation, that will not happen unless we contend with the liberation of Turtle Island that is leading this in the context of the US settler colonial entity.
I got another question that's going to lead into voting. All right. Mamdani and Bernie Sanders both appeal to MAGA for being like, we're actually offering what you're looking for. Socialism actually is offering what, the poor white person and the rural farmer is looking for without addressing settler colonialism, Zionism, because they are Zionists, and all these other issues. Are they offering us a right-wing socialism?
That's precisely more or less it, right? Because somebody like Bernie Sanders is a liberal Zionist who grew up in a kibbutz, who refused to call what is unfolding in Gaza as a genocide, who condemns our blessed mujahideen, who vies for a one-state solution. These are all liberal Zionist ethno-nationalist conceptualizations, whether it is in the context of the Zionist entity or whether it's in the context of the American KKK entity that again upholds the structure. So ultimately, absolutely. This is the degree of crisis and catastrophe that is constantly being reproduced because they sincerely believe in the American project and they're not willing to contest it from its origins, nor because to do that is to again situate it within its origin point of history. Um, Somebody like Bernie Sanders has shut down Palestinian protesters being vocal, and even Black Lives Matter protesters at the height of the Black Spring, and there are plenty of videos with regards to that, right? And this is why it's so easy for Mamdani, again, as we noted before, to flip-flop it with regard to defund the police and then come back to it, and so on, and to tame sort of the scope of which NYPD officers having to deal with houseless people or people that struggle with mental health and so on and so forth. Um, and this is not to get into, the Muslim, the Arab, the immigrant settlers of color who are part of the architectural machina of the NYPD and its collaboration with the Zionist, its training with the Zionist. This let alone the American military industrial complex, right? But this is the conscription of Black and brown people to go and fight imperial wars elsewhere, to civilize, to democratize, to spread queer rights, homo nationalist positions, feminist positions, liberal feminist positions elsewhere in the world. Um, and so the preservation of the status quo, that's all that there is. Yeah, but this speaks to again the absence of what we need to be doing and what we are not doing insofar as the creation of alternatives as Black, Indigenous people of color, and the question of trust and the absence of trust that exists between us, that we look for the validation of white allies before we look for the validation of each other, nor the situating of our struggles in relationship to one another, nor how we internalize cultures of whiteness, because whiteness is not just a phenotype, a color of skin. It's a mentality, it's a way of being. It's a certain set of values that we subscribe to and that we reproduce, and that we refuse to question, or even if we question, or refuse to do much about. And so far as our day-to-day livings.
I believe in not voting. I believe it's more powerful than people voting. And it always pisses me off when people are like, if you don't vote, you don't have a say. It's like you just threw away your say. Anyway, so because it means I don't believe in legitimizing the state or these false leaders occupying my lands. Some countries force people to vote because it benefits the state if you keep voting and you believe in that. The next American elections are likely to not be very valid or have written off all kinds of people from voting if they even occur. So, in what ways can people empower themselves by not voting?
Well, voting preserves the electoral system, and we should sit down and analyze further that, uh, if there are dimensions of gentrification, if there are dimensions of redlining that are involved, of voter disenfranchisement and redistricting, we are nothing but pawns and political ploys of grandiose corporations and politicians and political parties, or even third parties that aspire to the world of the above. So, and as we noted, that is normalized on stolen land. And if erases indigenous sovereignty because everybody does their little part every 4 years or during the midterm elections. Think about all the energy, the time, the labor, the money, the billions of dollars, if not millions, that are expended or were expended from the Bernie's campaign of 2016 to 2020 to the squad, Senate campaigns, Congress, House of Representatives, let alone to mayor. How many abolitionist groups or initiatives could have been established? How many social centers? How many workers' cooperatives? How much land could have been rematriated to indigenous people using those funds, using those resources? That is what is lost. The Panthers never walked the corridors and hallways of power. They invested within their communities. They were invested towards the below. And any funneling or any time digression, time reinvestment, and it merely upholds the legitimacy of the settler state, because what you're saying is that I believe in an American identity. I believe that this is my rights. I believe that this is part of my responsibility of privilege. I believe in the politics of representation. I believe in the hierarchy that sustains it. I believe in the respectability politics that animates it, the advertisements that showcase it. And so everybody begins to play this game. The Native American, the African American, the Black American, the Queer American, the Asian American, the Muslim American, the Arab American, the I don't know what American. But the actual American who doesn't have to hyphenate their name is the white American because they're assumed to be the native of the land, because everybody buys into this American everything. Meanwhile, indigenous people are relegated as signposts to history. They only remember when their names are on weapons of mass destruction, Apache helicopters, and Tomahawk missiles, or when their names are placed on football teams, the Washington Redskins, the Chiefs, and so on and so forth. And nothing is being done with regards to the absence of clean water, the suicide rate, the carceral rate, the missing and murdered indigenous women. And at best, as the Democrats have proven during their Kamala circus acts of land acknowledgements. Oh, look, we are in stolen land. And they'll bring indigenous people of this territory or Y territory to we identify that we are from this region, we are from this territory, and this is stolen land. But this is, as we know, land acknowledgements are not just land acknowledgements, they're about intent, purpose, and action. Say it again, intent, purpose, and action. This is my intent in stating that I am a settler on stolen land or I'm from this territory or region. This is my purpose in stating, though, this is the action that I do to undo it as part of my politics of responsibility. But all electorals preserve is a politics of rights. Because states are built on the foundation not to reconcile between the various different demographies that exist as far as different communities and different arrivals, different newcomers, different genders, different races, but establish the lowest common denominator of struggle that is necessary for a party or a leader to get elected. That's it. So it's not a consensus-based model.
Yeah.
This is the illusion that is being sustained. But it's actually about a pitting of oppressions and a competition and Olympic struggle between one another that we already reproduce. It's just stratified and hierarchized within the modus of electoral politics, because the state hierarchizes power, it crystallizes power in a certain manifestation, despite the fact that all power belongs to the people. So why relinquish that power? And so when people even say, well, we need to establish a base of power, we already have power. We're just choosing to invest that power in certain directions. But if we divest, this is the difference, and language becomes very important, right? To say that I'm going to dismantle something means I'm going to invest time and energy in order to dismantle this thing that is a monster, that is far more powerful, systematized, and is impossible to overcome, than to say I'm going to divest my energy, my resources, my time, and I'm going to funnel. So it's sort of like saying, well, I'm going to dismantle capitalism. In what world am I going to be able to do that? But as opposed to going and shopping at Walmart or the Bay or wherever it is that people get their clothes, their groceries, their means of belonging and survival in the world. What if we collaborated together, remiterated land, started to learn how to farm, how to sow and grow our own food. We've actually composed ourselves as more of a threat to capitalism, as the Panthers did. This is why the breakfast program constituted for Hoover for the FBI as a source of terror. Because that means that we are no longer reliant and are more resilient, no longer depending on the state and our corporations to feed us, to house us, to shelter us, to clothe us. For our breath, we're the very air that we breathe. But people don't want to do that because it involves an investment in each other as a people. And I don't believe in mass movements. I do believe, as our mujahideen, as history has proven, with the Panthers, with the Zapatistas, and as the Quran teaches, how much of a small group defeated the larger enemy. This becomes the key point. So it is the absence of enough constructed alternatives, because to dissuade and to build a different way of life, because the single mother who's trans, who has 2 or 3 kids, who's working 2 or 3 jobs, she may well very believe in a politics of liberation so far as Palestine, but she will come and say, well, show me, as an example, where the alternatives are. Who's going to feed my kids? Who's going to pay my rent? How are we going to live differently? Show me a different way. And then people will, or most of the folks will point to the electoral campaigns. And look, Mamdani is going to change your way of life. It's a way of abdicating responsibility.
Yeah.
So people want to relinquish the responsibility to corporations, to institutions, because again, they have a poverty of imagination, something that we all suffer. This is what happened at Tahrir in 2011. Right? For 18 days, we were in control of our own streets. Now, of course, Tahrir played out differently because the options were, if you were the military-industrial complex, it's a long-standing investment and foundation within, especially in the so-called post-colonial era, 1952, the overthrow of the British, the nationalization of the Suez Canal, and so on. Or on the other hand, the Muslim Brotherhood that were the only organized faction. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood started as a mutual aid project, did not want to get into contestation with the state and establish alternative schools and hospitals. That's why it was such in a powerful position. And it would have been wise actually not to get into electoral campaigns and to sustain itself, but it became and represented an Islam of the above. So this is the irony, that the pharaoh is dead. Removing the pharaoh out of the equation does not eliminate God's space and power. It makes us all demagogues vying for God's space and power. And of course, in Tahrir, you have the Naserites, people who supported pan-Arabist socialists, Nasser, but they had no particular agenda. We have the Sadatists, people who follow Anwar Sadat, who normalized with the Zionist entity, Camp David Peace Accords in 1980, with the revolutionary socialists who are Marxist-Leninists, who also wanted a piece of the pie. We had the anarchists, had queers, that did not have an opportunity to create alternatives, but created alternatives post-Tahrir, but also were quite critical, again, and I don't want to homogenize or essentialize queer communities because there are queer liberals, there are queer even Zionists that existed in Egypt, there are all kinds of different queer leftists, there are queer Muslims, and so on and so forth. But the point being is that it wasn't a monolithic subset group of people, right? But Tahrir offered us an opportunity and a gift from Creator to say, well, show me how you're going to do things differently in terms of a way of life. But we didn't go, and we're going to get into this discussion, to explore indigenous notions of sovereignty from spiritual perspectives, which is part of the problem, because we upheld instead, and the major moniker and slogan Tahrir was bread freedom of social justice. So free Palestine. You go and ask, what do you mean by bread? What do you mean by freedom? What do you mean by social justice? And different people will give you different responses to these questions, even if they come from the same ideological backgrounds, right? And hence the irony, right? That people can conceive of non-statist conceptualization of sovereignty because they've accepted as a de facto condition of the nation state, even if they are critical of capitalism, without an understanding of how capitalism and the nation state fit together. And why electoral politics is held and propped up by corporations.
This is Mamdani that's tagged as a social. What does he not need to
carry out campaign advertisements? And of course, they depend on an influencer world and celebrity activist kind of world, and it's all part of the corporate machine. So this is the irony. So much for being a socialist and an anti-capitalist or somebody who's critical of corporations and the influence that they have on our lives. But by seizing and relinquishing the control that these entities have over our lives, then we're able to construct an alternative way of life. But so long as we are captured, because capitalism has the ability to capture us the way that it does, we become slaves and or continue on in our enslavement and in the afterlife, the slavery projects. That's how they harm and not as wards of the state, as wards of corporations, and we're unable to conceive of a different ground. This is why the Zapatistas built, and in January 1st, 1994, they declared war on the Mexican state that is a settler state. Where is that declaration of war on the American entity? There is none. Nobody believes in the goddamn America. They'll whisper it. But as soon as they whisper it, it will, be like a dandelion, where a sunflower sort of seed that disappears in the wind. It's carried. But the building of a movement that is unflinching, that is uncompromising, that is what's key here. This is not about freedom of speech. This is not about academic freedom. Freedom never really existed. And all these are settler institutions, including certainly academia, and stuff that is merely an extension of the state. This is what the students, which we'll talk about, and so forth, they kept opened up a portal as youth into a world beyond. The possibility. Were there failures? Yes. Were there certain victories and possibilities? Crevices? Ruptures? Absolutely. That is the nature of uprisings and models of all shapes and forms. The question is whether people want to preserve a constancy, the continuity of that way of being in the world, a rejection of Colombia, a rejection of the NYPD, a rejection of the settler state. And this is why I say revolutions involve people willing to take responsibility, not for today, not for 18 days, but for in perpetuity, for a different way of life.
I'm going to say something to wrap up the voting part, because it reminds me of two Indigenous stories about voting. And I would say one way that we can measure freedom is how many things are we responsible for? Because in my teachings, I'm taught that freedom is to be able to be responsible. And in voting, when we vote in a democracy, we are giving up responsibility. We are saying, I only need to have a say once every 4 or 5 years, and the rest of you can make all the decisions for me. We're giving up responsibility. We're giving up freedom to decide how our lives will be run to other people. In the late 50s, Indigenous people in so-called Canada were getting more politically active because there were some things we were finally allowed to do, like be in court. And Trudeau Sr. was creating the white paper. And that is talked about today in Indigenous circles as something Indigenous people defeated. We stopped the white paper. But that's not the whole truth. We didn't actually stop the whole white paper. The part we failed to stop was something the elders of that generation, so the elders of my elders, didn't want Indigenous people in Canada to have citizenship. They didn't want us to have Canadian citizenship because when they looked south of the medicine line, they saw that our Indigenous relatives in the US consider themselves American, having had citizenship since the 20s. And so the one part of the white paper we failed to stop in 1960 was we didn't want Canadian citizenship. We didn't want it because the fear was that by my children's generation, we would consider ourselves Canadians. And we do see this. And the other part of this is I've spoken about, like, I don't believe in Indigenous politicians. So what about Elijah Harper? Elijah Harper didn't believe in being a politician. He became a politician to stop the Canadian Constitution and being cut out of this rights-based framework And when he achieved that, he stopped being a politician because he didn't believe in electoral politics because his elders said we shouldn't be citizens.
I'll say one last note with regards to that, and you're absolutely right, and I agree. New Zealand has a Maori party. Have they been able to achieve land back? And by all means, they tend to be quite radical in terms of their politics, parliamentary politics at least, but have they been able to achieve land back? No. New Zealand is still a settler colony. Canada, as you noted, with a multi-party system. Isangler is running on the mission statement or the political platform alongside with the NDP, and I respect Eve, with land back as part of its bullet points. Will never be achieved. It's using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house.
I'm madder
That
at
will
him
never
for
achieve.
that than anything else.
And the irony is the fact that Indigenous sovereignty, given the demographics of Indigenous genocide and ongoing genocide, Indigenous people cannot achieve, this is not out of disrespect, this is not out of the degree of dignity to which I hold Indigenous people, but cannot achieve Indigenous sovereignty of their own. The demographics, the resources, the logistics do not hold. And so until immigrant settlers of color ally with Indigenous people, side by side, and assert that sovereignty by force, by any means necessary.
On the rails, not in voting.
Yes. That will not be achieved. So this is the degree of dynamic that if one is to uphold Gaza as a compass, one has to contend with and face. Otherwise, forget it. Otherwise, we have betrayed Gaza and we have betrayed where we are situated. So, we'll leave it at that.
Yeah. And I'm mad at him for saying that. You can't make land back part of being a leader of settler colonialism because you're not fucking going to do it unless your promise is Canada will no longer exist. It's not land back. It's not. It has to cease to exist, just like the US and Mexico has to cease to exist, and so does Israel. So, for folks, we're going to wrap this up, and we're going to do this again soon and not make you wait like 2 years this time.
Inshallah not.
So people can also put questions in the comments. And these were some of my questions I wanted to explore, but I would really love to know some of the questions Mohamed would love to explore for next time also.
We'll do this again soon. And thank you so much for taking the time and your labor, your generous hospitality, and your insight. We go way back, and I'm grateful for every moment that we get to spend reflecting on our people, our movements, on our intertwined faiths, on lessons from our ancestors and our elders.